The exclusive policy roundtable in Washington, D.C. had the air of an optimized corporate strategy session. Jeff Bezos, the billionaire innovator and market disruptor, sat at the head of the long, sleek conference table, surrounded by his top strategists, tech journalists, and think tank fellows. His presence radiated data-driven control. This was his room, his agenda, and in his mind, his rules for the future. Across from him, Jonathan Roumie sat poised, but unyielding. He hadn't been invited as a collaborator. He had been summoned as the token, unconventional voice, a figure of moral conviction meant to be outnumbered and overwhelmed by technological prowess. But Jonathan wasn't there to play defense. He had come prepared to call out the unchecked technological expansion he believed had eroded human connection and community. The meeting began predictably. Bezos spoke with a calm but calculated tone about leveraging AI for societal good and building hyper-efficient global systems. His words drew nods from his allies, but Jonathan caught the selective phrasing immediately. When he raised his first objection, that Bezos's innovations, while convenient, had often come at the cost of local economies and the human spirit, the atmosphere shifted, a few eyebrows lifted, the cameras tilted toward him. Bezos chuckled condescendingly. "Mr. Roumie," he began, "I've been building and scaling global platforms since before you were born. You can't expect to understand the complexities of optimizing for billions of users." Jonathan's reply was instant. "And yet, with all your decades of experience, you've managed to turn thriving neighborhoods into mere data points. I understand that perfectly." The room stirred. Bezos' smirk faded. He leaned forward slightly, signaling that the polite fencing was over. Jonathan's quiet tone had drawn blood, and he knew it. The verbal chess match was about to become a full-blown battle. The discussion around the table began to fragment as Jonathan's words lingered in the air like an unwelcome truth. A few attendees shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to seeing Bezos challenged so directly in his own curated environment. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, a faint glint of irritation flashing in his eyes. "I see," Bezos said slowly, his voice sharpening slightly. "You've come here to lecture me about matters far beyond your operational comprehension." The remark was coded in technological superiority, but it carried an unmistakable undercurrent of impatience. Jonathan didn't flinch. "What you call comprehension, Mr. Bezos, most Americans call common sense, or perhaps compassion. You can fund all the white papers you want, but the facts on the ground show your policies are hurting working families and fragmenting communities." His voice was steady but forceful, as though he was speaking for every human voice that never got invited to rooms like this. The tension ratcheted up with every exchange. Bezos's allies interjected, trying to run interference, tossing out talking points about economic growth and seamless global connectivity. Jonathan met each one with precision, citing stories of human impact, local business closures, and community erosion, realities they couldn't easily spin away with statistics. Bezos's patience thinned visibly. He placed both palms flat on the table, leaning forward. "This is an important strategy session," he said firmly, "and I will not have it sidetracked by anecdotal or unquantifiable objections." Jonathan fired back without missing a beat. "Then maybe you should stop giving me so much human experience to work with." The room froze. A ripple of muffled gasps spread among the guests. Bezos's jaw tightened. His voice rose, not in a controlled retort, but in something closer to a shout. The kind of break in composure that happens when a carefully maintained public image of calm efficiency is suddenly under siege. They were now seconds away from the infamous get-out moment. The air in the room felt heavier now, like the oxygen had been replaced with pure tension. Jeff Bezos's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, his usually composed expression tightening into something far less controlled. A moment before, the discussion had been sharp but contained. Now it teetered on the edge of outright confrontation. Jonathan sat unwavering, his gaze locked on him, refusing to give an inch. He wasn't just responding to his talking points anymore. He was challenging the very foundation of his influence. The more he spoke, the more obvious it became that he wasn't there to play by the unspoken rules of polite corporate sparring. Finally, Bezos leaned forward, his voice cracking the air. "Get out." The words weren't just loud, they were laced with an impatience that made a few attendees flinch. It was a command, not a request, and it carried the raw frustration of someone unaccustomed to losing control in public. For a split second, the room went dead silent. Every eye shifted to Jonathan, waiting to see if he would retreat, apologize, or attempt to de-escalate. But instead, he leaned in slightly, his tone calm, yet cutting. The kind of calm that only comes when someone knows they hold a deeper truth. "You can shout as much as you want," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "But the truth doesn't leave this room just because you tell me to. And neither do I." That was it. The unflinching defiance that transformed an awkward exchange into a viral moment. Phones discreetly recording from the sidelines caught every word, every flicker of Bezos's face as he realized he had miscalculated. This wasn't just an unconventional voice to be brushed aside. This was someone who could take his own stage and turn it against him live in real time. The moment Jonathan's words cut through the silence, the energy in the room shifted from tense to electric. It was no longer just a heated exchange. It was a collision of two worlds, and everyone present knew they had witnessed something rare. A few attendees exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others smirked quietly, as if savoring the unexpected reversal. But for some, the scene was almost too uncomfortable to watch, their gaze darting anywhere but the table where the standoff continued. Jeff Bezos, still seated but visibly rattled, leaned back with an incredulous half-smile that failed to mask his irritation. His usual arsenal of composed rebuttals seemed momentarily out of reach. Meanwhile, Jonathan stayed steady in his seat, his posture a silent declaration that he wasn't going anywhere. Not physically, not morally, not rhetorically. In the back of the room, several people suddenly angled their phones for a better shot. Clips of the confrontation were already racing onto social media in real time, hashtags multiplying within minutes. The phrasing of his comeback, "The truth doesn't leave this room just because you tell me to," began trending almost instantly. Advocates for human-centric technology were already hailing it as a masterclass in fearlessness, while critics scrambled to reframe the exchange as disrespectful grandstanding. By the time the meeting limped toward its next agenda item, it was clear that the agenda itself had been hijacked. The real story was unfolding online. Twitter threads dissected every facial expression. TikTok users looped his quote over triumphant music. News sites scrambled to get their headlines up before the moment passed. Jonathan didn't even check his phone during the meeting, but he didn't need to. The look on Bezos's face told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a defense. This was a moment that would follow him and his message far beyond the four walls of that conference room. Bezos took a deep breath, clearly trying to pull the room back under his command. The sharp tension in the air hadn't faded. In fact, it was thicker now, almost visible. His trademark calm demeanor was showing cracks. He adjusted his jacket, leaned slightly forward over the podium, and spoke with deliberate precision. "Let's be clear," he began, his voice carrying that seasoned mix of authority and persuasion he'd cultivated over decades. "This isn't about personalities. This isn't about who can preach the loudest. It's about the direction of innovation, about ensuring data-driven solutions shape our future." But the problem was his words were bouncing off an audience that had just witnessed one of the most charged exchanges of the year. People weren't thinking about data-driven solutions. They were still replaying the moment when Bezos had, in a flash of frustration, barked, "Get out!" at Jonathan Roumie. That kind of raw, unfiltered moment doesn't disappear with a talking point. Jonathan, standing just a few feet away, read the shift in the room like an open book. He could see it in the eyes of the audience members, the subtle smiles, the raised eyebrows, the way some leaned in as if waiting for round two. He let him speak for another 30 seconds, but every fiber of his moral instinct told him this was the moment to strike again. When Bezos paused to take a sip of water, he stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Bezos," he said evenly, but with an undercurrent of steel, "you say this isn't about personalities, and yet you made it personal the moment you tried to throw me out of this conversation." A low murmur rolled through the room. He didn't raise his voice, but each syllable landed like a weight on the table. You can't claim to innovate for humanity and then try to silence the human voice that challenges your method. That's not progress. That's control. For a split second, Bezos froze, just enough for the cameras to catch it. Jonathan's words weren't just for him. They were for every viewer watching the live stream, for every clip that would be cut, captioned, and shared on social media within minutes. He was playing the long game, knowing full well that in the age of viral sound bites, winning the moment often mattered more than winning the policy debate. Bezos glanced down at his notes as if searching for the perfect rebuttal, but Jonathan had already planted his flag in the ground. The battle for control of the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The energy in the room was no longer balanced. Bezos's earlier authority seemed diminished, replaced by the awkward awareness that he'd underestimated his opponent. The audience wasn't just watching a debate anymore. They were witnessing a clash of generations, ideologies, and styles. Several people in the front row leaned forward, smartphones poised to record what they knew could become the next viral moment. In the back, a few attendees whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the two figures on stage like they were tracking a championship boxing match. Jonathan didn't need to shout. His confidence came from the way he held the microphone, the way he kept eye contact with Bezos, and the way his pauses forced everyone to hang on to his next word. You've spent decades building algorithms and orchestrating systems from behind the data centers, he said, his tone steady but cutting. But humanity isn't a server farm, and I'm not here to play along with your script. A faint ripple of agreement went through the crowd. Even those who disagreed with him politically couldn't deny the precision of the hit. Bezos adjusted his glasses, a small gesture, but one that telegraphed discomfort to anyone paying close attention. Trying to regain footing, he began listing policy points, reeling off statistics about AI ethics, workforce automation, and global supply chain optimization. But the problem was Jonathan wasn't trapped in his frame. He was building his own. When he mentioned misinformation, he immediately pounced. Misinformation, he repeated, tilting his head. That's the label you use when people hear the truth you don't want them to hear. Laughter and applause erupted from multiple corners of the room. Bezos pressed on, but the interruption had landed. The camera zoomed in, capturing Jonathan's composed demeanor against Bezos's tightening jaw. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was flipping the dynamic, forcing him into a reactive stance, and everyone watching knew it. This wasn't going to end with a handshake and polite applause. By now, the tension in the air was almost tangible. Bezos had come into the room expecting to dictate the pace, but Jonathan had taken control, and the audience knew it. Every time he tried to steer the discussion back to his prepared talking points, he intercepted with a sharper, more relatable counter. His voice carried a clarity that cut through the formal setting. You talk about protecting progress, he said, pointing subtly toward him without breaking decorum. But what you really mean is protecting your own algorithms and market share. An influence, Mr. Bezos, isn't a birthright. It's a responsibility, one you've been abusing. The crowd reacted like a wave crashing, half of them applauding wildly, the other half frozen in disbelief at the audacity of saying it to his face. Bezos's lips tightened, and for the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. Jonathan pressed the advantage, pivoting the discussion to the human costs of policies and platforms Bezos had publicly championed. He referenced real-world consequences, citing towns and communities that had suffered under initiatives tied to his name. You don't live in the communities your platforms displace, he said, his tone surgical. You launch them, you scale them, and then you retreat into your data-driven life while the rest of humanity pays the price. A few gasps escaped the audience. Even in the front row, one of Bezos' own aides shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Bezos tried to respond, but it was no longer a debate. It was a reckoning unfolding in real time. Jonathan had shifted the audience's perception, reframing him not as a towering figure of innovation, but as a man cornered by his own record. The cameras caught everything: his unwavering stance, Bezos' visible frustration, the crowd's mixed reactions. This wasn't just a verbal exchange anymore. It was political theater at its rawest, and Jonathan was owning the stage. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, a tightening in Bezos' posture, a faint tremor in his voice as he tried to retake control of the narrative. But Jonathan saw it. He smelled the breaking of an established order and pressed forward with precision. Mr. Bezos, you've built an empire influencing consumer behavior, shaping public discourse through media ownership, and leveraging data for unparalleled societal impact. And yet you stand here pretending you're a champion of human progress. That's not progress, that's control. The audience reacted like a split screen, one side erupting in applause, the other shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to clap or recoil. Cameras zoomed in on Bezos' face, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting to his team for rescue. Jonathan wasn't just debating anymore. He was dismantling. He read off a list of examples where automation had led to local economic devastation, where data collection practices had eroded privacy, and where the relentless pursuit of efficiency had dehumanized labor. The crowd's murmur grew into audible reactions, gasps, head shakes, even a few "that's right" shouts from the back. Bezos tried to counter with statistics about long-term economic benefits, but Jonathan cut in sharply. Long-term benefits? Tell that to the families who've lost livelihoods and communities because your pet projects prioritize profit over people. You don't get to hide behind algorithms and jargon when people's lives are on the line. The tension was electric. Bezos leaned back, hands clasped tightly as though bracing for impact. Jonathan's delivery had shifted from defensive to prosecutorial. Every sentence was a blow, each fact sharpened into a weapon of truth. By now, the audience's attention was fully on him. Even those who came in skeptical of his stance were now leaning forward, captivated by his command of the facts and his refusal to back down. He wasn't just holding his ground, he was making him play defense on his own turf. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric, as Jeff Bezos leaned forward, his voice low but sharp, laced with years of corporate power and influence. You think you can walk in here, challenge everything I've built, and not face the consequences? His eyes were locked on Jonathan, his tone dripping with disdain. The earlier outburst, the infamous "get out," was still ringing in everyone's ears. But now he was going for a calculated strike, the kind that could crush reputations. The journalists in the room froze, pens hovering above their notepads, cameras ready to capture every flicker of emotion. Jonathan didn't flinch, not even a blink. If anything, the corner of his mouth curled into a subtle, almost sorrowful smirk. He had been underestimated before by the media, by seasoned corporate veterans, by people who believed age and status were shields against accountability. But he knew this moment was bigger than both of them. This wasn't just Bezos versus Jonathan. It was the embodiment of two clashing visions for humanity's future. "You've built an empire on algorithms and ambition," he said, his voice steady, but each word hitting like a hammer. "And now you're afraid of someone who refuses to bow to it. That's why you shouted at me. That's why you want me gone. Because the second I speak the truth, your narrative cracks." His words were deliberate, echoing through the room, drawing murmurs from the press. Bezos's jaw tightened. The man who was used to dominating conversations was now being challenged in front of an audience that smelled blood in the water. He tried to interject, but Jonathan raised his hand slightly, not in a disrespectful way, but with the commanding presence of someone who knew he had the floor. "You told me to get out," he continued, his tone now gaining momentum. "But you don't get to decide who has a voice in this world. You don't get to bully people into silence just because you can write a bigger check or run a bigger platform. You may have influence, Mr. Bezos, but I have the truth, and the truth doesn't answer to you." A few gasps broke the silence, followed by the rapid clicking of camera shutters. It was the kind of exchange that would explode online within hours. Clipped, shared, debated. The tech heavyweight versus the unapologetic advocate for humanity. Jonathan took a single step forward, closing the gap between them just enough to show he wasn't intimidated. "You can tell me to leave 100 times, he said, his voice dropping into a near whisper that somehow carried across the entire room. "But I'm not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, and definitely not because you told me to." At that moment, it wasn't just a verbal clash. It was a battle of wills, and the tide was turning. The audience could feel it. Bezos, for perhaps the first time in years, looked like a man who'd lost control of the narrative. And Jonathan, he looked like someone who had just claimed it. The moment hung in the air like a suspended note, sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. Jeff Bezos's glare was unwavering, but the damage had been done. The "get out" he had hurled minutes ago had transformed from a command into a rallying cry not for him, but for Jonathan Roumie's message of human dignity, which was already lighting up social media. Clips of his fiery response were being cut, captioned, and shared at lightning speed, each one amplifying the shockwave that had just hit the corporate and political sphere. Bezos shifted back in his chair, clearly recalculating. The man who had mastered the art of controlling a narrative could feel it slipping through his fingers. For years, his presence alone was enough to silence opposition. But this time, the person standing across from him wasn't just challenging his words. He was dismantling his aura of untouchable authority piece by piece in real time. Jonathan, still standing tall, glanced briefly at the sea of cameras. He wasn't grandstanding. He was making sure every person watching would remember that he didn't back down. "Mr. Bezos," he said with a calm that only made his words more cutting, "people like you think you can dictate who belongs in this conversation. But you forget one thing. This isn't your platform alone, and it sure as hell isn't for sale." Gasps echoed again. Bezos leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, the faintest twitch betraying his frustration. He tried to interject one last time, but Jonathan didn't give him the satisfaction of another back and forth. Instead, he turned slightly toward the audience, a symbolic shift that signaled who he was really talking to. "You told me to get out," he continued, voice now carrying the cadence of a closer. "But I'm staying right here. I'm staying in this fight because if I leave, you win. And I'm not here to make life comfortable for tech titans who think they can program humanity. I'm here for the people who are tired of being told their humanity doesn't matter." His tone was unshakable, each sentence a deliberate strike. The reporters were scribbling faster, the camera zooming in, hungry for every second of this confrontation. It wasn't just a soundbite anymore. It was a moment, the kind that crystallizes into a powerful testament to conviction. Bezos sat back, realizing there was no recovering the upper hand today. The verbal duel was over, and in the eyes of the public, Jonathan had won decisively. As he turned to leave the stage, a wave of applause erupted from the back of the room, hesitant at first, then building into something impossible to ignore. It was an unplanned, unscripted endorsement of his stand. By the time he stepped outside, his phone was already buzzing. Texts from allies, strangers, even industry rivals who couldn't help but acknowledge the force of what had just happened. In that instant, Jonathan wasn't just the principled voice who had gone toe-to-toe with Jeff Bezos. He was the symbol of what it looks like when someone refuses to be silenced. And Bezos, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one controlling the story. In the end, what unfolded between Jeff Bezos and Jonathan Roumie was more than just a fiery exchange. It was a collision of two very different visions for humanity's future played out in front of millions. Bezos's command to get out was meant to shut him down, but instead it became the spark that lit one of the most defiant and resonant moments of his career. Jonathan didn't just respond, he seized the moment, turned it on its head, and reminded everyone watching that no amount of money or influence can silence conviction. His words were sharp, his presence unshakable, and his refusal to back down sent a clear message. If you want him gone, you'll have to do more than shout. And as the applause echoed and the clips went viral, it was clear this was no longer just about a single confrontation. It was about the fight to have a voice, the right to stand your ground, and the truth that sometimes the loudest thing you can say is that you're not going anywhere.